Good morning and afternoon, wherever you are. Thanks for joining us all today. I would like to welcome everyone into the Pentaho webinar, Getting Started and Successful with Big Data, which is the second in our four-part Big Data Integration webinar series. Your presenters today are Davey Ness. Davey is the VP of EMEA and APAC for Pentaho. We have our special guest, Paul Brook. He's the Cloud EMEA Program Manager at Dell. And Chuck Yarborough, the Technical Solutions Marketing for Pentaho. And Chuck's going to be giving a live demonstration later on in this webinar. Again, please don't hesitate to send in your questions for the Q&A session at the end. And with that, I'll hand it over to Davey.
All right. Thank you, Rob. So as Rob mentioned, this is the second part of our four webinar series on Big Data Integration. For those that join us again from the first part, I welcome you again. It's obviously good. It must mean that we did something right the first time, and I hope you'll enjoy this session as well, and obviously the next ones following from here on. So today we're going to focus on getting started and successful with big data, and it's going to be a little bit of more pragmatic, tactical session today, where we will take you through a couple of elements to make you get going very quickly with big data, Hadoop, and Pentaho. So first of all, we will explain how you can get an Hadoop cluster up and running, and Paul Brook from Dell will tell you a little bit more about Crowbar, which is a very exciting open source initiative Dell has launched to help you get a cluster up and running. Then obviously we'll also cover where Hadoop and other pieces fit into the architecture, and that's actually something we'll start off right away with. And then we'll then also talk how you can get data in and out of Hadoop, leveraging Pentaho, and Chuck will show you some technology there and showcase how easily it can be done. And then we also want to share some initial best practices. As you can imagine, we've done quite a few big data projects already, and we're starting to see some common pitfalls, and we want to warn you for those. All right? The first thing we want to start off with is to make it a little bit interactive and get an understanding of what your cluster situation is today, whether you already have one or maybe several installed, whether you're planning to install a Hadoop cluster, whether you have no plans so far, or you're just exploring the field. So if you want, please make your selection, and once we get a good set of results here, we'll show those. From our part, I'll also answer. There we go. And as the results are coming in, you see that for now, most people are sitting into the category where they're sort of exploring the field. Well, that's good to know. So we hope that this session today will help you a little bit more on making up your mind. All right. Moving along. So just to give you a revisit of what we talked about in the first session, we really see predominantly three use cases emerge from how people are leveraging big data. One is around the data ingestion, enterprise data warehouse optimization, helping on the ETL side and streamlining that process. The secondly is to do some enterprise ad hoc reporting and analytics on new types of data feeds, and obviously increasing data feeds. And the last step is to leverage machine learning and predictive analytics, to get again some new business initiatives going by leveraging the data feeds that are becoming available more and more. Now, if we revisit the first part, then we explained how Hadoop sit nicely around and alongside the data warehouse, so we don't necessarily believe that you should replace Hadoop or look to replace the data warehouse with Hadoop. What we explained on the first series, that it probably sits alongside your data warehouse, and the initial quick win that you can get is leveraging Hadoop to optimize your data warehouse, taking some of that ETL processing, batch processing that you're probably doing overnight, pushing that down to Hadoop, using a distributed processing engine and storage to basically offload those processes from your data warehouse. Now, as we continue, obviously the next step is kind of figuring out, what do I do next? So I figured out this is something I may want to look into. I want to take it to the next step, and I'm sort of want to get a cluster going. So there are a couple of steps that you need to start with Hadoop. So first of all, there's the Hadoop installation. And again, you have a few options here. Paul will explain one of the tools they have with Dell, like Crowbar, that can help you to get from an empty machine, some metal, and eventually get a cluster going and manage that cluster, fine-tune it, and make it as operational as you want to and need it to. The other option is that you can also install Hadoop locally and run in a sort of pseudo-distributed mode. That's especially handy if you want to do some quick development, some quick checks, and see how that could be leveraged for your specific developments. And the third option is there are a couple of providers out there that could provide a cloud sandbox that you can connect into and start playing around with. Now, from there, you got a cluster. Now, obviously, you want to get some data in and start processing some data and see how that may potentially react to what you want to achieve. So one of the options, obviously, is to install Pentaho. From our side, again, that's an easy download and installation. We can easily go to our website, download Pentaho, get it going, and again, you can start on a desktop. You don't need a cluster. You don't need a big server setup to get going with Pentaho integration or even the full stack. So again, you can start fairly locally so that you can test things out first before rolling out on bigger hardware. And thirdly, you may want to start loading some data. It's either extracting or accessing data from your source systems. You probably don't want to load it in its raw form into Hadoop. You need to tokenize and parse it so that you can start working with it as you normally used to do with data in columns, transform and reach that data, and then ultimately load it back into a destination so that from there on you can use it in either any reporting infrastructure from analytics or just a simple input to other steps that you may want to perform. Just in 1, 2, 3, you can get something going very quickly, and it doesn't take a whole lot or a whole big infrastructure to start experimenting with this and get something live. Now, if you look at the overall architecture and sort of look at the bigger picture data architecture integration challenges, then we know once you start to look into Hadoop and all the other pieces that may fit into that architecture. So you have on the one side, you have your data sources where a lot of your operational data is originating from, whether that's ERP, CRM. Then obviously there's new data streams and feeds. Clickstream data log files, for instance, are one of those. There's maybe social. Maybe there is machine-generated data, telemetry data, for instance, that's being generated. Some of those flows are already developed and ongoing, and you may want to push into your data warehouse and from there into an analytical data mart. Some of those are not yet developed, and you may want to push into a NoSQL database or then eventually into Hadoop. Now, what that means is that you're getting several data integration challenges, and you're moving along not just with one, but there are 3 areas where data integration all of a sudden becomes important for you. You have your traditional extract, transform, load, which you probably now mostly will attack with a typical batch ETL process overnight or wherever and how frequently you may want to run that. Secondly, you have a whole orchestration and integration challenge that says, okay, beyond my traditional ETL, I now may want to start moving some data around, because once I determine I want to upload the data warehouse with certain responsibilities, you still want to get back into the context of a lot of the operational data that you may have. Once you say, I'm going to process and upload some of the transactional data or clickstream data into an Hadoop cluster versus into an enterprise data warehouse, you still at one point may want to link those unique user sessions into actual customers and may want to understand whether that specific web log session led to any purchases and to what kind of purchases. So you want to link it back and do some further orchestration and integration. And then finally, as you are leveraging Hadoop and the processing capabilities it has to offer, you'll also have some MapReduce data challenges. So all in all, you're going from a sort of a one-dimensional extract transform load situation into a sort of a threefold challenge. And what we notice when we talk to our customers is that there's a lot of benefits to be gained if you can sort of orchestrate and run all that from one single source application engine, if you like. So that's one of the things that we also want to cover, because that's definitely something, as you'll start to experiment, you'll run into certain challenges, and then you want to stay within the same environment and make sure that you pick the right sort of tool to attack that particular problem. Now, like I said, there are three main issues and three main challenges you want to cover. First, getting a cluster installed. Secondly, getting that technology ready so that you can start playing around with data. And thirdly, eventually loading up some data. So before we go dive a little deeper into that first challenge and how you could potentially leverage Crowbar and Dell to get a cluster up and running, let's do one more poll, and then Paul can take over and talk a little bit more about what they're doing on Hadoop and how they can help you out. So the next question we have for you is, where do you, sort of knowing what we just talked about, where do you see the biggest challenge? Is that actually in getting the cluster up and running? And is that preventing you from potentially going into this direction? Is it more around the MapReduce framework and working with data inside of Hadoop? Or is it about integrating with existing data? And you may have a data warehouse and you may want to couple that, sort of the Hadoop-related data with your operational data. Or then lastly, or is it more around, okay, now I have all this data, I have some data in Hadoop, I have some data in my data warehouse. How do I make that raw data, for instance, that I may want to flush through Hadoop, how do I make that ready for analytics for my business people? All right? So we're waiting for some more results before... I'll pick one from our side. There you go. So if we look at the results, we see that most people are definitely looking at integrating with existing data and then also making that ultimately that data available and ready for further analytics for the business user community. That's pretty much in line what we see out there as well. Especially with some of the technology that we provide and we see that's available. Those first two steps. Once you know where to go, should be. I'm going to say easy, but you should get that under control. But it's integrating everything and then ultimately servicing the business, that could be pretty challenging. Right, having said that, I'll now hand it over to Paul Brook from Dell, and he's going to talk to you more about Crowbar and the initiative they're doing. Paul?
Davey, thank you very much. Thank you very much indeed, and good evening, good morning, good night, good afternoon to everyone, and there's a lot of you on this webinar. First, I want a big thank you to our friends and partners at Pentaho. I've not been a special guest before. It kind of feels like I'm walking into a Letterman show. So in my head, I've got applause going on here. Forgive me for my English accent. I know in Hollywood, it's normally the bad guys that are English. So bear with me. I hope by the end of this short 10 minutes, you'll feel Dell are one of the good guys, and the English guys put across a nice, pleasant story about how we can help you get quickly into Hadoop, get quickly into deploying Hadoop and solving some of the challenges that revolutionary or disruptive technology can sometimes bring. Now, one of the things we're very keen on at Dell is taking the phrase big data and twisting that into actually more of an answer, which is big insights, which is why I was delighted when the crew at Pentaho asked us to to talk on this webinar, because we feel Big Insights are absolutely what Pentaho are delivering to you as users. Now, typically, and when I say typically, I was at a Hadoop meetup last night, and we get to talk to folks who are thinking about Hadoop, as many of you are on this webinar today. And for those of you listening to the recording, if you're thinking about Hadoop or you're taking your first few steps, it's often people outside of the infrastructure team in an organization that are kind of saying, hey, this is where I get my value from. So what we then see is, software people, BI people, business leaders turning to infrastructure teams, and these are actually real and common questions that, once you decide to do this, you've realized that there's high value in what this solution can bring to you, those big insights. And then the question goes, hey, we're software guys, we're analytics guys, we're business guys. How do we bring in the hardware to make this happen? How do we size the hardware so we're not building too big, or, even worse, building too small? And as a bit of a hardware guy, I'm going to share a kind of bit of inside information here. Sometimes the hardware guys have been known to slow projects up, saying we're not ready, it takes time to do. So I'm going to cover a few ideas that we've had in Dell to help you guys kind of reduce the time it takes to not just size and design your Hadoop cluster and then bring in the Pentaho software, but also the time it takes from when the infrastructure products arrive at your site or your hosting partner's site to getting that deployed. And actually the point here is to get this into production, because there's high value in getting the valuable outputs. That's got to be the critical point. And then, as Davey was saying, that there's options and opportunities as you get more familiar with the technology, be that through training or, big fan of this, good old-fashioned learning by doing, to say how can we optimize this and how can we tune this. Because like any investment, what business leaders want is to see what's the best return on investment you can get. So there's a bunch of tools that we use, a bunch of tools that we can put at your disposal. And what I'm going to talk about first is, when we call it the Hadoop solution, that doesn't begin to describe what we're about. This is kind of the infrastructure layer wrap to get you going or keep you going with the underlying technology. And often the first step on this is simply to say, hey, how do I size this? How do I know I'm going the right way? And what we have, you download this from Dell.com, or hey, there's nothing wrong with phoning your local Dell account team or getting in touch with Dell and saying, I want me a copy of some of your white papers. These are free, open source documentation. This is intellectual property in a document. And we will drill into how we feel you can optimize your infrastructure, not just the server, but the network layer and the Hadoop special features to give you as an organization something that's right for you at the time you want to enable that. So you'll see just on the slide there a very colorful snapshot inside the document. This drills right down into a bill of materials. You can look at what you want to size and then match that to Dell products on the website and get in touch with your Dell contacts. There's a heap of folks at Dell right across the world who are waiting to talk to you about how big insights can be delivered into your business with fantastic partners like Pentaho. Now, this reference architecture then stretches out, and hey, we really get what stretching out means to involve not just documentation, but a common question customers had for us is, yeah, I can buy the equipment, but this sometimes is hard to actually deploy. So we developed a product called Crowbar. It's a great little name, isn't it? Crowbar. Kind of really suggests that it's a pretty easy thing to do. If at first you don't succeed, crowbar the software into your cluster. Well, that's strange how we get these names. And then in true style, we decided, having developed Crowbar, to give it away and open it up to the community. Oh yes, Crowbar, my friends, is free at point of use. You can download it from www.dell.com/crowbar. More on that later. I also want to just call out, if you're thinking and moving towards deploying a cluster, that a great way, once you've got your hands on the documentation, is to engage in a dialogue with Dell. Now, do that through Pentaho or come direct to Dell. Do that through your local Dell partner. We will bring to you something a little special, because what you download for free might not be the best version of Crowbar that we can get to you, because it's a community program. So we're constantly aware of what the best is, and while we're trying to keep the downloadable version as up to date, what we get is sort of releases and pre-releases and advantages that come into us. I'd urge you guys to talk to your Dell representative, your Dell channel partner, your Dell ecosystem partner. Talk to Pentaho and say, hey, I want to bring Dell in. That's a good thing. And in kind of reward for that, we'll give you the best of the best we can do for you at the time. And I just want to be quick on this one, because here we go. It's a marketing slide, my friends. It's a marketing slide. Hence the deploy a Hadoop cluster in 2 hours. Now, I'm not saying every one of you will be able to deploy a Hadoop cluster in 2 hours. What we did is took this into our labs. We've got a 75-node Hadoop cluster. It's using the Cloudera Hadoop distribution. And when we hand-cranked the deployment, it took a while. When we deployed with Crowbar, now remember, we developed Crowbar, we reduced that time significantly, and we arrived at the 2 hours pretty much based on the experience our technicians, not the developers, our technicians had in the lab. But of course, lab technicians, it's their job to get the hold and hang of new systems, and they were pretty familiar with Hadoop to start with. So we believe, and here's a lovely English phrase, it's from the days of sailing, with a following wind, you too could deploy a Hadoop cluster from bare metal in 2 hours. And this is an example of why that becomes feasible. A good old-fashioned screenshot from the Crowbar downloadable, free-to-use tool. You can see here it's a relatively small cluster, fantastic to get a feel of what you're about with 12 nodes. But actually our experience is it's not everyone that has giant Facebook, Yahoo, and Google-size Hadoop clusters. 12 nodes can provide you with a tremendous amount of value to your organization, particularly, as Davey was saying, when you're starting to look at how you can use just stupendous tools like Pentaho to sit in front of your existing enterprise data warehouse. So as a special guest, I love that phrase, my time is pretty much up. What I'd urge you to do is get on the downloads, get familiar with Crowbar. As a tool, the more you familiarize yourself with the tool, and through the documentation, familiarize yourself with what's going to work for you when you start to move towards deployment. Hey, get your hardware guys to look at it. Get them to read up on the networking. Get the resources from the GitHub. And of course, www.dell.com/crowbar is the place to go. Davey, I've got to thank all of the crew at Pentaho, ask the questions on the chat. I'll be staying on the call because I want to soak up some more of this fantastic information from you guys. But that's me done. I thank you very much.
Hey, great. Thank you, Paul, and thank you for taking the time to come and explain about Dell Crowbar. Very useful. And I guess for a lot of people, potentially also relieved that there's definitely no excuse anymore for the hardware guys to be slow, that there's an easy solution out there for them if they want to leverage it. So moving along to our second point that we wanted to point out was Pentaho Installation. In similar style, so you can go to our website, go to pentaho.com/download and get a version of our technology. You can have the full platform and then decide which parts you want to install. Likewise, like Paul explained, it doesn't necessarily take a lot of time to install. Depending on where you are, maybe your download could even take longer than the actual installation of the platform, which obviously is a big difference to some of the other technologies out there. Now, the major benefit that we have with Pentaho and that will allow you to start experimenting with Hadoop and other big data technologies is that you can install it on a local desktop. So there's no need for a cluster, there's no need for a server farm or anything like that. Once you want to start playing around, there's no need to install Pentaho within the actual Hadoop cluster. So what we eventually will do is a process called managed code, in which I'll dive in a little deeper later on. But there are no additional installations required of Pentaho or any other parts inside your Hadoop cluster for working with it. So eventually we will write to the Hadoop distributed cache for execution. So what you'll get with that installation is a no-coding environment. Again, if you want to leverage code, that is up to you. So you want to work with Pig and Uzi scripts, for instance, or Hive queries, or some native Java MapReduce code, that is up to you. That's all possible. But ultimately, our goal is to help you move away from that, which again will help you to get going fairly quickly. And then you have an engine that will allow you to schedule, and then obviously integrated data from other flows, data warehouse, other analytical data marts that you may have, manipulate or better transform, enrich the data as you require, and then finally also orchestrate all those flows so you can start building, pulling some data into the file system, enriching that data, and then writing it back to a destination, either file folder within, again, the Hadoop file system, or eventually even an external data source, so that you can start do some visualization on top of that. Part of the Pentaho installation as well will be something that we call InstaView, and that actually can already help you to instantly visualize the data that you may be loading into Hadoop. There's definitely another session we'll do, Series 3, and specifically the fourth part of our webinar series, we'll dive into a little bit more the visualizations, and we'll show InstaView in more detail. Now, the last step, so that means fairly easy going steps 1 and 2. Now you got your whole infrastructure up and running. So the next step is getting our hands dirty. It's starting to load data into the file system, into the Hive space if you want. Actually, the two mechanisms are pretty similar. So we have one particular step that's a Hadoop copy file step, and based on where you specify the folder destination within Hadoop, that will actually determine whether it's a pure file system or Hive. Ultimately, if you want to load it into HBase, which is a NoSQL part for Hadoop, then all you need to do is specify the Zookeeper host and port, and then specify the HBase mapping. And then again, that's it's all you need to start loading up, log files or text files that you're getting from whichever sources. Okay. So as the next step, Chuck will show some of that and dive into a little deeper of what all the other parts are as you start to play around with data and get into MapReduce. But before we do that, let's do one more poll for today, which is trying to understand a little bit which distribution you potentially are using or considering. We're not separating out the commercial from the potential community additions that some of these distributions may have. Obviously, Apache Hadoop, it is the, I'll call it the original flavor. And so for that purpose, let's pick that one from our side. And then there are others obviously available as well. All right. There you go. So it looks like the original Apache Hadoop is most popular, followed by a tie of Cloudera and none. Okay. So having said that, I'll give now the floor to Chuck, and Chuck will take us through a quick demo of the platform, get you a little bit more insights on how easily you can load up data, start experimenting with Pentaho on top of Hadoop. Chuck,
okay.
It's all yours.
Thank you, Davey. I appreciate it. And Paul, thank you. Very entertaining. I enjoyed learning more about Crowbar. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my desktop. Let's see if I can get this to work. And I'm going to, now that we've gone through the initial setup of Hadoop, and I noticed that a lot of you on the phone are in those early stages. They're just starting to work with it, just looking at your options. So it's really appropriate to talk about, okay, now we get our Hadoop environment stood up. We've got that available. Now it's time to go and do something with it. So what we're going to talk about today is Pentaho's data integration tool, PDI for short, which allows us to connect to all kinds of data, manipulate that data, and move it into the Hadoop environment and continue to process it there. If you were on last week, you heard Dave Henry talk a little bit about Visual MapReduce. I'm going to talk a little bit about that again today, but also talk a little more about just the manipulation that you can do and where you can get data from and how you can get it into Hadoop. So on the screen you should see our GUI tool, which allows you to build your transformations. Within PDI, you can build specific transformations that allow you to manipulate the data. So what you're looking at here is a fairly comprehensive transformation, and it's front-ended by a MapReduce input. And if I scroll to the right, you'll see there's a MapReduce output step. So what makes why that's important is everything in between is just standard Pentaho transformations. But when you bound it by the MapReduce input and output, it makes it available to run directly on the Hadoop cluster and within the distributed cache and take advantage of all of that. Now, and then the beautiful part is that you're doing this without a lot of coding, because the option when you start, once you've got your Hadoop environment up, you've got to figure out how to get your data out there. So it's either a lot of coding or you can use Pentaho data integration. So this example that I have on the screen is what we call movie lens. So there's a big data set of all kinds of movie information, public source information. And what we do is we come in here and we have a number of steps where we parse through the data, and then we begin to enrich the data. So just to show you, here's a step here where we bring in user information. If I open up this particular transformation step, you'll see that there's a file that is used. I can preview this. Now this file would be a file that exists out in Hadoop. And we're going to bring some of those elements into the data set so that we can enrich it as we go through this process. So to be really quick, we go through and we apply some user information, some household income information, occupations, and some movie information. all the while processing within the distributed cache. Now, Davey talked about the orchestration of these jobs, and that is done through a step or a job such as what you see on the screen now. So in this series of steps, you'll see that we call specific transformations such as the MapReduce transformation that I had just looked at. So, for example, here, if I open this up, you'll see that in this MapReduce job step, it has options for mapper, combiner, and reducer. So here you simply point to your MapReduce transformation, which was the transformation I just showed, and that will take that transformation and put it into the distributed cache and let Hadoop then distribute that across all the nodes. So you don't have to worry about how it fits in. You don't have to code it. You don't have to copy it across or install anything. It happens at runtime. So, to show you another example, let me look at a different map job that I have. It's a slightly more simplistic view, but again, you'll notice that it's front-ended by the MapReduce input and output. In this, we are going to go through some very simple functions. We're going to split some fields. We're going to do a calculate to figure out month, day, and year. If I, just to give you an idea, there's this particular calculator step can be used for all kinds of things, not just dates. But you'll notice that when we're looking at dates, it's all right here. Again, it goes back to simplifying things, right? We don't have to hand code every little transformation, every little step. So it takes a lot of the pain out of processing in all environments, including Hadoop. Continuing down through this particular transformation, we extract data. We pull out pieces to carve out. In this example, we're using area codes, but it could be anything. And then once again, we're going to reach out to another input file. In this case, it's a file that resides on Hadoop, but we're going to enrich the data set that we're working on. What we want to talk about is in your environment, when you're just starting and you're just getting going, your data probably doesn't exist in Hadoop, and it's probably all over the place. You've probably got it in relational tables. You could have it in flat files. I know somebody asked a question about clinical data. Well, this is where the beauty of Pentaho really comes to play, because we can bring in transformations, particular steps, such as a table input step, where we can point to a relational table. We can bring in, maybe it's marketing data with Google Analytics, or somebody that was asking about the clinical data might use HL7, which is related to healthcare. So all of these inputs are available to get your data, and it could certainly just be text files. So all of those are out of the box, ready to go. You simply drag them onto the panel, and you can begin working with those sources of data and continuing with your process. So literally, this Hadoop input, I could replace it with a table that sits in Oracle or some other data structure or database. So now I'm going to look at the job that would run this particular MapReduce process. And this one looks a little bit simpler than the one I showed before, but in short, it goes through a copy process to move data into Hadoop. So here I'm taking data from my file system, and by the way, I'm running a Cloudera distribution in Linux on a VM. So here I've got my source data, and I'm going to copy that. That's how simple it is to copy data into Hadoop, is just this one little transformation step. Now, as I put these pieces together, so the next thing would be to run that mapper that we just looked at. If anything fails in here, I'm going to send out an email. So again, taking all the pain and really reducing the time to produce something that's significant. So before I run this, I'm going to open up a browser, and I'm going to go and show you that I am running Hadoop. I can browse the file system. You can see I've got a number of directories out here, call records. I've got some input and some output files. And if I go into the reference, you can see that there's this call records CSV file was updated earlier this morning. So, and if I open up, just for fun, let me open up a job tracker. You can see there are some jobs that have been running today or previously. So now I'm going to go back here. I'm going to go ahead and execute this, launch the job, and you'll see that as the steps are going, that Hadoop, if I switch back over here, so you'll see now that this job is running. This is the inbound phone call, and it's processing. If I look at my log, and this is something I want to make sure that you understand. This is, again, one of the important features of Pentaho. This little piece right here is where it just went away. Let me step back here. So you can see now the job is finished, and I go back here. You'll see it's 100% done, and you should notice that the file is there now. So again, I'm going to go back here. I want to just show you this one thing. Right here where it says configuring Pentaho MapReduce job to use Kettle installation. This is where Pentaho passes that particular transformation at runtime to the cluster, to the distributed cache, which then distributes it across all of the nodes. In my case, it's just one node. But in a case of a 12 node, it would spread that out appropriately, and it'll handle that, something you don't have to worry about. So in just a real short amount of time, I was able to point to a bunch of different data sources, pull those in, transform the data, enrich the data, and literally create a MapReduce process that I was able to execute against a fairly large data set, and make it execute in a very short amount of time. So I know it was real quick, and I kind of went through it fast, but we're short on time. So I just wanted to walk you through that. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me or anybody at Pentaho. And Davey, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. So, and I'll sort of follow up with a great point that Chuck pointed out in the log file that he at the end just showed. So as you've seen, Chuck went through a fairly elaborate example of what is required if you take some log file data and then want to eventually get it into a consumable format within an Hadoop cluster, potentially enrich it with some lookups so that people can analyze the data and get some good statistics out of it. Part of that is, as we leverage Hadoop, and this is also cycling back to one of the questions I saw in the QA, Pentaho doesn't really need a server cluster to run on. The whole idea with using and leveraging Hadoop is that Hadoop is a distributed processing and storage framework. Well, the whole idea is that you make it work. You make Hadoop do the hard work. So we don't do installations in every node into the cluster. We don't generate MapReduce code and then sort of get that distributed. No, we actually talk to the named node cluster, write some of the jar files and some of the execution mechanisms that are required for Hadoop to execute the MapReduce job that you've designed into the Pentaho designer, and then let Hadoop distribute that accordingly, and let it make its own decisions on how it wants to tackle that particular job. So that's pretty important, because that actually eliminates the need for having to install a separate ETL cluster next to Hadoop if you fully want to leverage Hadoop. Obviously, there are other scenarios. We talked about three potential challenges that you may have in terms of data integration. Some of those others may require you to get a little bit more beefy ETL layer, but specifically for leveraging Hadoop, it is not required. All right. Now, the last point I wanted to share with you is alongside this is some best practices that we've experienced as we do all these implementations. So the first one is, again, to the same point. You want to leverage Hadoop as much as you can. One of those parts is you don't want to do database lookups inside a mapper and reducer and sort of go outside the cluster to get data from potentially your data marts or enterprise data warehouse. Two reasons for that. First of all, it's not going to be that efficient. It's going to be pretty slow, most likely. And secondly, you may not have full control on how many data connections will be created. So all of a sudden, if you have 100 mappers, that means you could have 100 connections into your database. That's not going to go very well with other applications and connections to that database. That will slow down things significantly. And it's a lot easier to bring some of that data just into the file system, into Hadoop. Like I said, it is a fairly commodity type of technology. It doesn't cost a lot to store extra data. So taking some table dumps and pushing them into Hadoop file system and doing your lookups internally is going to be a lot more efficient. Again, to our point previously, you don't want to transfer data between two clustering technologies. So when data is, again, sitting into one piece clustering technology, whether that's a data warehouse or whether that's Hadoop, you don't want to start loading data from one to the other. You want to maintain that and limit that to as much as possible and only do the required. If anything, it could overload your network. There are people, physically shipping disks of data because even some of the cloud connections cannot cope with some of the data volume. So you don't want to start internally pushing data from one system to the other if, again, duplication of data is a lot easier to do. As you experiment and start working with some of your initial and first MapReduce jobs and connecting to the cluster for the first time, pushing some data into the cluster for the first time, you don't want to boil the ocean, meaning you want to start with a very small set of data. Actually, one of the cool benefits that Pentaho offers is that you can validate the logic and performance outside the cluster. So if you have a certain data set and you want to check whether your enriched transform logic and some of the calculations you're doing are accurate, well, you can remove the MapReduce wrappers that Chuck showed and just run it on a simple database, for instance, just to check the logic. Once you understand the logic, once you potentially also understand some of the bottlenecks that may occur, then you can say, now I further want to fine-tune it and start working it into the cluster. And then, again, you don't want to go from I got a fairly small test data set and boom, in one step, I'm going to go on to full production scale, because there are a few moving pieces in here. There's the application itself, so the logic. There's the cluster performance, cluster size. There are data stores involved. There's network tuning involved. And as you sort of scale up, you want to understand all the impact and all the different pieces and how they're fitting together, so that ultimately when you do hit a wall, that you know where it's most likely to come from. As an overall development environment, it's really an end-to-end situation. There are various technologies available. We obviously, from our perspective, we think leveraging tools, leveraging an ETL tool like Pentaho that allows you to orchestrate, integrate data without coding is great. But obviously, some tasks, maybe it is a lot easier to write that Hive query. Maybe it is a lot more effective to write a Pig script or a Python script. The good benefits that we offer to you is that you can actually make a combination of easy-to-use tools, and then very powerful scripting and custom coding mechanisms to provide you with a full mix to address every piece of the challenge you have. And that is something that you have to keep in mind. That some people are too rigid in their thinking and say, all of a sudden, Pentaho is not going to be able to address all of my coding challenges. Well, no. Then just leverage Pentaho to do orchestration of some of that code, of those scripts, and then use some of the scheduling, the mechanism, the orchestration, managing the dependencies, for instance, managing the error handling, for instance. Those are all wrappers that we can easily provide around some of your more specific logic. So it's definitely an end-to-end situation. That wraps up our session for today. So we will go into some Q&A. There's a couple of good questions that I've seen fly by in the chat. Before we go into Q&A, just wanted to highlight once again, we are going to do a third session next week. We'll be with some other people from Pentaho. We'll talk more about reducing the implementation efforts of Hadoop, NoSQL, and analytical databases, and really go into a more detailed version of some of the solutions we sort of lightly touched upon today, and dive deeper into in all of those parts. If you are leaving us already before the Q&A, again, if you need some more information, feel free to contact us or sign up for the other sessions at Pentaho.com. All right, so now we'll take some questions. Chuck, did you see any question that you wanted to address?
Yeah, well, so there was one about getting data in and out of Mongo. And so, what I showed was real simple, a table input, but there are specific input and output transformations for some of the big data stores like Cassandra, like Mongo, and so forth. And actually next week we'll actually be drilling into that in more detail. But yeah, so those all exist there. Okay.
Another one I saw was, do you have any step-by-step document on how to start with Hadoop? Well, one of the things is, like I said, we try to sum it up a little bit today as very overall high-level steps. Obviously, every Hadoop installation is pretty personal specific. What we do have is we have a sort of a sub-site, PentahoBigData.com, where there's really a ton of information, and that can explain you all the various parts of the Hadoop ecosystem, and potentially give you some more details on in which direction you may want to go at Hadoop. Part of that is also we've done some template of the week sessions where I believe Chuck and others are demonstrating various ways of how to connect and get certain data into Hadoop or other parts. And those tutorial videos are very educational and really can get you going fairly quickly. So I do recommend to go to PentahoBigData.com, and there's a ton of information, also a data integration toolkit that you can start looking at to make sure and sort of to leverage as you require. The other question I saw was what version of Hadoop is supported by Pentaho? This is a little bit of a challenging one in the sense that I think we all can agree this is fairly new technology, and it's very much a moving target. Not so much from the different releases and how quickly and fast some of these companies are coming out with a new release of their product, but then also in addition to some of the additional distributions that are coming out. It's not just one version of Hadoop. There's a whole layer of distributions. So we already support a whole ton of them. And we do, again, on Pentaho.com, we have a matrix of the ones that we support. And if you have any questions or have any plans on using a particular version, then again, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to let you know which the latest version is that we're supporting and by when we potentially may support the next one. In addition, as we roll out our new products, we have learned a lot in how all these various distributions are trying to create their own flavor of Hadoop. And we have been creating some common layers, some shim layers in between that really allow us to connect more easily to all the different distributions and versions, and will also allow us to much quicker develop and maintain sort of the certification and connections to those distributions as they release new products. Then, Paul, we got a question from you on Crowbar, and that one was, somebody wanted to know a little bit more about the technology behind it and in what it was written.
Yeah, great question from Monty there. Thanks for that one, Monty. Crowbar was developed both for our Hadoop customers and customers who are investigating some of the open source cloud products like OpenStack. So it owes a lot to the open source community. Chef is really key in that. There's some elements, if you're familiar with Puppet, that you take a look at and go, yeah, I get this. So in true open source style, which might sound weird coming from a Texan company, but Crowbar has its origins in open source, so we're delighted to provide it to the community on that basis. It would be very wrong, we felt, at this stage to try and do anything other than the right thing. So if you're familiar in Chef, you'll be very comfortable with Crowbar. Thanks, Davey.
All right. Thanks, Paul. And let's leave it at that as we are sort of coming close to the top of the hour. Obviously, I hope to be able to welcome you on our next series next Wednesday on the 22nd. Like I said, probably with some different hosts, but nonetheless a very interesting topic where we will dive into more detail on not just Hadoop, but also NoSQL and analytical databases, and sort of show you a little bit more in depth how that reference architecture that we're starting to see to emerge, how you can leverage that and what the challenges are, and again, how we can fit in to help you with those challenges. But thank you very much. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.